President Salovey asked us to articulate principles that would govern decisions on whether to rename a building, significant space, or structure on the Yale campus. And we took that seriously.
One thing that really struck me throughout this whole process was that Yale isn't alone in having this sort of conversation.
We are inspired by the Woodward Report, which established principles that are utilized not only at Yale, but frankly our framework for the respect for free speech throughout the country. And so we see ourselves in a similar way establishing a framework for making decisions about tough issues such as the question of when and whether to rename a building or an institution because of the legacy of the namesake.
Well, I would not have joined the committee if I had thought that it was a rigged deal. I obviously, a huge amount of the discussion we had was about Calhoun. I did not have a preconceived idea of what the answer was supposed to be, nor did I have a preconceived idea of what I thought the answer was.
We are not going to be producing a document that operates only in this moment. The document we will have failed in our job if the document we delivered can be stamped as a 2016 document always. We want these principles to be as applicable in 2056 as they are today.
I think in a perfect world, this might have happened a year ago before any decision was made at all, but the world's imperfect. We all know that. And so I think that the university should be commended for taking a deep breath and a pause and saying, let's go back to basics here and have a framework.
One of the first things we did as a committee was try to separate ourselves from the question that had been mooted about on campus last year over Calhoun College by studying other institutions and by thinking about other places and by thinking about the history and theory of naming and renaming. We spent a lot of time with some work by Robin Winks, a longtime Yale historian, who made a really important distinction between the erasing of history on the one hand and the commemoration of history on the other.
We approached the issue from as many different angles as possible. So looking at theories on naming and renaming, studying the history of some of the namesakes at Yale.
Input came from every direction. God knows there are a lot of talented and learned people in the Yale community, so there's a lot to draw on. And some of it was in conversation, and many people wrote about this.
John Witt gave us 1,200 pages of reading and many hours of talking to people and listening to people. I think one distinction that we made clear was that there's a distinction between naming and honoring.
There was an intentional effort to try to give an opportunity for members of this community to give voice to their ideas, to their concerns, and to give us insight and input so that we could then develop those principles mindful of the values of a liberal arts education and of a free society.
These were not just opinions or statements of emotion. There were very thoughtful arguments on both sides.
When it comes to thinking about renaming, even considering renaming a building, the bar has to be very high. The historian in me understands that we tell stories about who we are by the names that we use for buildings and places and things. So names are important. It's not simply a random choice or an inconsequential choice. When these names run afoul of the values that our institution represents, not the values of our particular moment, but the transcendent values of our institution. And if the name of the building is in contradiction to those core values, we need to start thinking seriously about about that name.
I think the principles are ones that thoughtfully have limiting factors and conditions that should be considered whenever the whenever there is a question about whether there should be a renaming.
You really have three windows into history. One, the life and times of the person who is the namesake. Second, and that can take place at some point in history. Another window in is, when was the naming decision made? And what occasioned the decision, and what informed the decision? And then finally, today's student life and community. You know, how does that inform what was done at different points in history? So I think that was, among many things, a really fascinating part of any inquiry. Looking at, windows into different moments in history when different decisions were made, and then to see how it holds up and reflects in today's community.
You have to look at all three of those and say, was this person just completely out of line with the university's values at any of those three times? If so, which ones, and by how much?
We need to have humility as a current generation and about imposing our ideology on all generations in the past and all generations in the future. I think we should have respect for the past. On the other hand, I think that there are clearly circumstances where naming and therefore honoring can interfere with the legitimate mission of the university.
Names are important symbols, and they have meaning, and they inform and define the values of a community, and sometimes they ought to be re-examined.
Certain renamings can be erasing. If one were to rename and then ignore the past history of the name, then that would really be an erasing of history that might be dangerous from any number of perspectives.
There's a distinction between erasing history and between honoring somebody in the voice of the university, for example. And that was a distinction that wasn't, necessarily all that clear to me.
But it is pretty clear that you can rename without erasing. You can rename and add history. You can do various programming. You can create plaques and the like, which can make sure that you memorialize the fact of the history in all of its ugliness, if it's ugly. And some of the history, of course, is ugly.
We would be doing a disservice to our own values, the value of research and knowledge, if we didn't address those things. So I think renaming is not a repudiation. It is something the university must weigh very carefully. But that's what scholarship does. It weighs things very carefully, makes a decision.
When I think about what this committee says about Yale, I think it says something important about an institution that wants to take principles and ideas seriously and also wants to confront really important questions about how to organize a campus that's diverse and inclusive, and that should be diverse and inclusive, while also maintaining really important traditions of free expression and academic expression at the same time.